today's World Insight with Tian Wei, our special program from Hanoi, we focus on Kim Jong Un's state visit to Vietnam. Although the DPRK and Vietnam were once brothers in arms, can Vietnam show the way as an economic model for the DPRK? Hello and welcome to World Insight special program on DPRK Vietnam ties. I'm Tian Wei in Hanoi. Relations between Vietnam and the DPRK were forged in the midst of the Vietnam War. In addition to military and economic aid, Pyongyang sent pilots, even according to some history book, to shoot down American planes. In the 2 decades after the Vietnam War ended, economic sanctions and a trade embargo coming from the U.S. crippled the Vietnamese economy. But with the determination of opening up and reform, Hanoi's economic fortunes reversed. The World Bank now touts Vietnam as one of the most dynamic emerging economies in Asia. Meanwhile, the socialist bond between the DPRK and Vietnam remains limited to a kindergarten and some restaurants only here in Hanoi. Besides the highly hyped Kim-Trump summit, Kim Jong Un also paid an official visit to Vietnam. What will Kim Jong Un take away from his 4,000-kilometer journey down south? Take a look.
It's been over half a century since the last time a DPRK leader set foot on Vietnamese soil. Kim Jong Un's meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump was cut short on Thursday, but the DPRK leader started his official 2-day visit to Vietnam on Friday as scheduled. Walking beside Vietnamese President Nguyen Phu Trong, Kim received a proper head of state welcome ceremony. It was his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who provided significant aid to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But after peace finally arrived, the two brothers in arms embarked on different paths of development. While Pyongyang turned inward, Hanoi opened up to foreign investment and a free market economy. Starting with re-establishing diplomatic ties with Washington in 1995, Vietnam eventually managed to hitch its wagon with the world economy. On Saturday, Kim Jong Un is expected to head back home to the DPRK. The allure of opening up is obvious, but the lifting of sanctions comes at a price that he might not be ready to pay yet.
Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with the Made in Vietnam tag on everything from sportswear and now even to smartphones. But Vietnam had to struggle before its economy took off. At the end of the Vietnam War, the reunited nation was one of the poorest in the world. How did this war-ravaged country transform itself into an Asian tiger? I spoke to Vietnamese economist Dr. Ly Dang Thuan to find out earlier. And we are joined in our Hanoi studio by Dr. Ly Dang Thuan, who is an economist here in this country, well known to be one of the pioneers pushing for reform policy in Vietnam. Dr. Thuan, what a pleasure to see you here in our studio.
Thank you for having me.
Now, already the first day of the state visit, but the real question is, how much will Vietnam play the role in the opening up and the future development of DPRK?
I think Vietnam and DPRK face a very similar situation. It's a separate country and has ended the war, but now Vietnam has unified the country and has joined the international economy and has implemented successfully the transition to market economy. And I think the experience from Vietnam should be very useful for the DPRK, and I think it's one of the substantial issue of exchange of view between the two sides.
But you heard that argument over and over again. I mean, there's talking about the China model, there's talking about Vietnam model, there's talk about many other countries' models. Those are transforming themselves from a central controlled market economy, but DPRK is a very different case in that regard. Really, is there that much to share, Dr. Thuan?
I think Chairman Kim has made a study in Switzerland. He now understands our market economy, and as I learned, Chairman Kim has already implemented some element of market economy. He's allowed to a certain extent the trade on the free market at the market price, and the peoples could enjoy exchanging of goods and buying additional goods and services outside of the state shop.
Dr. Duan, as you may know very well, it is very much a intertwined relationship, not just between DPRK and the United States, but also other players in the region. For example, about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. So obviously, DPRK is facing much more complicated a situation than one would argue Vietnam when you opened up your country.
I think DPRK could start to diversify its economic relation, could increasingly integrate it in different organizations to join and expand trade to different economies, and by that way to ease gradually, not make a breakthrough, but gradually, step by step, move forward.
Now, Mr. Duan, both Vietnam and the DPRK are socialist countries, and the countries are governed by the ruling parties that are communist parties. Do you think the balance between the party and also the government, the state, an interesting one, an experience that also DPRK can learn, or rather get inspiration from Vietnam, or it is a totally different situation as you see it?
I think the experience are all the time useful, and Vietnam has learned very much from the outside world. It's joined the WTO, and by that way to change the legal framework, to update the constitution, and I think all these steps are quite interesting for the DPRK.
Now, before we go, Dr. Duan, what can we see in the immediate future about Vietnam and as part of the ASEAN's role in the interactions on the DPRK nuclear issue, particularly on the economic issue with DPRK?
Vietnam will try to intermediate and to assist to expanding trade, economic relations, and maybe to invite Pyongyang to participate on this and another activity of ASEAN as an observer or as a participant in a certain extent. And I think it will bring gradually more mutual, improving mutual understanding from both sides.
Thank you very much, Dr. Le Dang Tuan, coming from Vietnam, very well-known economist in this country. Really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
For more on the ties that bind the DPRK and Vietnam, in Singapore, we have Wu Tutan, the Deputy Regional Managing Director of the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. In Melbourne, we have Sun Young Lee, a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. In our Beijing studio, Gao Zhikai, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Start with you, Mr. Tan. Of course, on March the 1st, this is the first day of the state visit. But exactly how would you describe the nature of relations between DPRK and Vietnam?
I think the two countries have a fine relationship. They obviously are similar in a political system, both currently and throughout a long histories of decades. The similarity also in relationship with the United States. Both countries fought the United States and were divided for Vietnam at one point, and for DPRK, they are still, the peninsula are still divided.
About that, Dr. Lee, of course, there's a lot of people talking about the similarity, but Professor Lee, the question really is, are the two countries similar to one another? Earlier we asked many of our interviews at different occasions. we are facing some very different development stages of two countries who are facing very different fates for the future.
As we know, the United States has been trying to sell the Vietnam model to Kim Jong Un. Pompeo, on his visit to Vietnam last July, said, look at this prosperity, economic growth. We were former adversaries, but now we have a very good relationship with Vietnam. You too can do it. This can be your miracle too.
Mr. Gao, though, history is always an interesting mirror, isn't it? When people rush to conclusion about the similarities between the two countries, Vietnam and the DPRK, in fact, there are a lot of differences that many of those who are not familiar with history might not necessarily pay attention to. Dr. Gao.
Definitely. I think DPRK and Vietnam have many similarities in many lines of analysis. However, DPRK and Vietnam today are as different as you can imagine between two countries. And it not only involves the different stages of development, as you refer to, but also in terms of how the governments are structured, where the power is concentrated, and how it looks at its own people versus at the outside world, for example, and in terms of many other factors. The two countries are very, very different. Vietnam, after all, has a population of up to 100 million. It has a very long coastline. It is very much in the South China Sea, for example, and it has been opening up to the outside world and reforming its political system for many, many years. DPRK is far from that. And going forward, how DPRK will be developed, which model it will eventually adopt, is unknown to anyone in the world. So I think the similarities are highly limited as far as current day's analysis is concerned, and the differences are overwhelming.
Well, let me go to you, to our Vietnamese guest, Mr. Tan. If the model issue could be relying on the future to figure out, what about some of the reality issues on the ground? Now, we see the DPRK leader extremely interested in visiting some of the different companies, places, and places of interest as well. But the question really is, in practical terms, how much will Vietnam be able to help DPRK in the way it wants, while at the same time keep the good balance with the United States, for example, which of course has said very clearly the second summit failed?
Yeah, in terms of immediate selfish interests, Vietnam may not have much to gain from helping North Korea and Chairman Kim. But I think Vietnam does not just think in terms of immediate selfish interests. I think Vietnam wants to step up in the international arena by getting itself involved in the major security of the day, and therefore getting support and gratitude, if you will, from major powers such as the United States, China, and many other important trading partners such as Japan and South Korea. And also, in practical terms, Vietnam does send rice to North Korea, and perhaps some other goods as well. And Vietnamese businesses can actually come do business in North Korea when the moment is right. The Vietnamese, for example, the state-owned Viettel company has been doing businesses in many frontier, less developed markets around the world. Vietnam can also work with North Korea through South Korea as well, which I mean, South Korea has a very significant presence in Vietnam.
I see. Professor Lee, now you listen to the words of Mr. Tan, who sophisticatedly illustrates for us the ways that how Hanoi is thinking by working on the issue of DPRK will be able to bring itself onto the map and also contribute to the solutions of many of the issues that the rest of the world will care about. The question really is, will that work? Of course, any efforts contributing to solving a big problem will be appreciated. But the question really is, what is the approach? How do you see the Vietnam approach now?
So Vietnam,
Professor
of course,
Lee,
has a good relationship with not only North Korea, but a very, very good relationship. But Vietnam and South Korea have a wonderful relationship. They normalized relations soon after South Korea normalized relations with China in the summer of 1992. Vietnam and South Korea have a very robust trade relationship. We know Samsung has a big presence in Vietnam. So the fact that Vietnam, by virtue of its good relationship with both the North and South, with both Koreas, is uniquely positioned, and by virtue of its geographical location as well, to play the role of mediator, as a peacemaker, to hold a summit like this. And Vietnam has been very gracious in holding the summit. And I hope that the Vietnamese government is not let down by the lack of joint agreement and greater bonhomie that may have been achieved, because I think Vietnam comes across in the eyes of the world at large as a very gracious, very well-intentioned, neutral host nation.
Right. Mr. Tan, I want to come back to you just on that point. Is Vietnam going to be able to cope with the apparent failure this time? Of course, we heard a lot of silver lining words coming from the Vietnamese side, but still, deep in heart, is this going to be one of those very early challenges for Vietnam to come onto the regional stage? And also, given the fact of changes in the region, what does Vietnam aspire to become vis-a-vis its relationship with the neighbors and also on the hotspot issues, Mr. Tan?
Well, there's a saying in Hanoi, nobody comes to Hanoi to rush things. And it turns out to be true in this case regarding the summit. So the result, the like of that of the summit may be disappointing, but it's not totally surprising, so to speak. Because of that saying, I think the Vietnamese are very patient. It seems like that is also the message that both the North Korean leader and President Trump were also trying to convey to the public, that this kind of negotiation really takes time, and we should focus on the substance instead of the optics or some other superficial aspects. Now, regarding Vietnam's role,
right.
Please note that Vietnam is not an official an official mediator, right? It's the country is chosen as a host, just as Singapore was chosen in the first summit, right? It was just a host. It provided the venue, right? But unlike Singapore, given the special circumstances about Vietnam and its relationship with both North Korea and the United States, it can step up to be a mediator trusted by both parties. And I think Vietnam is ready for that, but it tries not to be presumptuous.
Both Vietnam and the DPRK are China's neighbors. And earlier, there were issues between China and Vietnam about the South China Sea, for example. There's also the security issue as a result of the Korean Peninsula nuclear crisis. So how does China see these two countries at different sides of issues dealing with China are coming together and try to play a role as they see they fit? Mr. Gao, your thoughts?
Well, definitely. As far as China's relations with Vietnam and China's relations with DPRK are concerned, there are many similarities. For example, we do not need to go into the details. However, you are absolutely right. Both Vietnam and DPRK are China's neighboring countries. We share both land borders as well as maritime borders. And in this respect, I think, as far as China is concerned, how to keep friendly and good neighborly relations with both of them is crucially important. And China does not want to have a major problem on its border or any of its neighboring country becoming a threat to China's security. For example, as far as the territorial disputes between China and Vietnam, as far as some of the islands or reefs in the South China Sea are concerned, we also want to have patience, we want to have negotiations, and keeping the stability, for example, and try to resolve these issues or differences by diplomacy and dialogue. And I hope the Vietnamese people and the Chinese people eventually will be reasonable in dealing with these disputes and prevent any escalation of these disputes into major conflicts, especially into armed conflicts between them.
And dialogue is exactly what's needed as well when it comes to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, gentlemen, the three of you, before we go, I would like to have some final thoughts from all of you about what can we expect at the end of the visit for Chairman Kim from DPRK in Vietnam. Will that be a story many of us would remember for the long time to come? Mr. Tan from Vietnam, please.
I think even without the summit, the mere fact that Chairman Kim, who doesn't travel abroad very much, could make such a long rail trip and then a short road trip from the border between Vietnam and China to the capital of Vietnam after some 60 years since the last North Korean leader visited Hanoi. I think that's in itself is significant enough. And Vietnam and North Korea now have a great opportunity to understand each other better and to discuss face to face on issues that they can help each other out.
All right. Professor Lee?
He has only traveled to China, to Singapore, and to Vietnam. I mean, he's met with the South Korean president in the border village, but not South Korea itself. What does that mean? Well, it means that Vietnam is, of course, high on his agenda in terms of improving relationship, cultivating new type of relationship with.
Last but not least, Mr. Gao, expectations. At the end of the day, at the end of the visit, will that be a story many of us remember for a long time to come?
I think even though this summit meeting in Hanoi did not result in a very positive and earth-shaking agreement, for example, I think this meeting will be written down in history. People 500 years from today or 1,000 years from today will still talk about this summit. And this summit meeting, whatever that happens in the summit meeting, will be talked about and studied again and again as a very typical case in diplomacy, in geopolitics, in country-to-country relations, in how personalities came in to play a role, and how two different egos meet with each other, try to overcome the odds and try to reach a deal in the best of their own interest, and failed in Hanoi. This will be a milestone case study in history for hundreds of years.
Well, that's quite a prediction you just made over there, Mr. Gao. Of course, what is very important that we're going to see what's likely to be the outcome of the state visit by Chairman Kim from DPRK in Vietnam. And with that, we want to thank the three of you for being with us. Vu Tu Tan from Vietnam, Professor Sun Yong Lee in the United States, and Mr. Gao Zhikai in Beijing. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.